On the morning of November 9th, 1971, 5 people died inside a 19-room Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. A mother, a grandmother, 3 children, ages 13, 15, and 16, all shot in the back of the head, all killed by the same man. Their bodies would lie undiscovered for 31 days in that house, arranged carefully on sleeping bags in the ballroom, classical music playing on repeat from speakers John List had set up before he walked out the door. The perpetrator wasn't a stranger, wasn't an intruder. It was the father, the husband, the man who drove them to church every Sunday, who worked as an accountant, who neighbors described as quiet and responsible. John List murdered his entire family, then disappeared for 18 years. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was methodical, calculated. A man who believed he was saving their souls by ending their lives. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Westfield, New Jersey, in November 1971, was the kind of place where people believed they were safe. Population 33,000, located in Union County, 21 miles west of Manhattan. Tree-lined streets with Victorian homes built in the 1860s when Westfield was a wealthy railroad suburb for New York businessmen. By 1971, it was still prosperous, still respectable. The kind of town where doors remained unlocked, where children walked to school alone, where everyone knew their neighbors' names. November in northern New Jersey meant temperatures dropping into the 40s at night, rising to maybe 55 by afternoon. The smell of wood smoke from fireplaces, wet leaves piled in gutters, that particular cold dampness that comes before winter truly arrives. The sounds were residential and predictable. School buses in the morning, lawn mowers on Saturday afternoons, church bells on Sunday from the dozen churches that served the town's predominantly German Lutheran population. But 1971 was a troubled year in America. The Vietnam War was tearing the country apart, the economy was unstable, inflation rising. President Nixon had just ended the gold standard in August, sending shockwaves through financial markets. Unemployment was climbing. Even in prosperous suburbs like Westfield, families were feeling the pressure. The certainties of the 1950s were crumbling. Traditional values were being questioned. For men like John List, who'd built their entire identity on being providers, on maintaining appearances, on doing things the right way, the changing world felt like personal failure.
The house at 431 Hillside Avenue was impossible to miss. Built in 1895, it stood 3 stories tall, with 19 rooms, a ballroom, stained glass skylights, and a widow's walk offering views across Union County. The locals called it Breeze Mole. It had been in Helen List's family, John's mother, and when she'd offered to let John, his wife Helen, and their 3 children move in after financial troubles in 1965, it had seemed like Providence. A beautiful Victorian mansion, rent-free. But the house was a money pit. The heating bills alone ran $500 a month in winter, equivalent to $3,800 today. The roof leaked. The plumbing was ancient. Property taxes were crushing. By 1971, the house that was supposed to save the List family was slowly bankrupting them. John Emil List was 46 years old that November, though he looked older. He stood 6 feet tall, thin, almost gaunt, with receding hairline and thick-framed glasses that made his eyes look larger than they were. He moved with precise, mechanical movements. Everything about John was controlled, measured, methodical. His handshake was firm but brief. His voice was quiet, rarely rising above conversational level even when angry. Every morning, John woke at 6 a.m., showered, shaved, dressed in one of his 3 conservative suits, navy, gray, or brown. Ate breakfast alone while his family slept. Oatmeal and black coffee, reading the newspaper in silence. By 7:15, he'd be out the door, briefcase in hand, driving his 1963 Chevrolet Impala toward the train station, heading to his accounting job in the city. Except by November 1971, John didn't have a job. He'd been fired from his position at a bank in Jersey City back in May. For 6 months, he'd been leaving the house every morning, pretending to go to work, sitting in the Westfield train station, reading newspapers and eating lunch from a brown bag, then coming home at 5:30 p.m. as if nothing had changed. He hadn't told his wife, hadn't told his children, hadn't told his mother, who lived upstairs in the mansion and depended on him for everything.
John List valued 3 things above all else: his Lutheran faith, which taught that suicide was an unforgivable sin, but that salvation was possible for any sinner who repented; his role as family provider, which he'd learned from his strict German father; and appearances, the belief that what people thought of you mattered more than the truth beneath the surface. He'd grown up in Bay City, Michigan, the only child of strict Lutheran parents who'd immigrated from Germany. His father, also named John, had been a rigid disciplinarian. His mother, Alma, had been suffocating in her devotion, infantilizing him well into adulthood. John had learned early that emotions were weakness, that failure was unacceptable, that a man's worth was measured by his ability to control his family and maintain respectability. He'd served in the Army during World War II, then earned his accounting degree on the GI Bill, married Helen Morris Taylor in 1951. She was a widow with a daughter, Brenda. Together they'd had 3 children: Patricia in 1955, John Frederick in 1956, and Frederick in 1958. John had built a life that looked successful from the outside. Stable job, beautiful wife, 4 children, church every Sunday. But the foundation had always been fragile, built on rigid control and absolute obedience. What John feared most wasn't poverty. It was humiliation. The thought of neighbors knowing he'd been fired, of his family losing the house, of being seen as a failure, terrified him more than death itself. The catalyst wasn't a single moment. It was a slow accumulation of pressures that became unbearable by the fall of 1971. First, there was the money, or rather, the complete absence of it. John had been secretly cashing in his mother's savings bonds to cover basic expenses. He'd stopped paying the mortgage, stopped paying utilities. The bank had started foreclosure proceedings. He was $11,000 in debt, equivalent to nearly $85,000 today. Every day brought more bills he couldn't pay, more lies he had to tell, more evidence that his carefully constructed life was collapsing. Second, there was his wife. Helen had developed what John considered a drinking problem. She'd sit in the kitchen in her bathrobe well into the afternoon, vodka in her coffee, staring at nothing. She'd gained weight, stopped going to church, stopped pretending their marriage was functional. She knew something was wrong with their finances, but John wouldn't discuss it. The silence between them had become toxic. Third, there was his daughter, Patricia, 16 years old, who John believed was becoming interested in acting. He'd found a playbill from a school theater production in her room. To John, theater meant Hollywood, and Hollywood meant moral corruption. He was convinced she was on a path to hell. Fourth, there was his oldest stepchild, Brenda, who'd moved out at 18 and rarely visited. John saw this as betrayal, evidence that his authority wasn't absolute. But the final catalyst came in late October 1971. John had received a notice from the bank. Foreclosure was imminent. Within weeks, they'd lose the house. The humiliation he'd been avoiding for 6 months was about to become public. Everyone would know he'd failed. On October 28, 1971, John List made a decision. He was sitting in his study, a small room on the second floor where he kept his accounting books and his hunting rifle. The house was quiet. Helen was downstairs, probably drinking. His mother was upstairs in her apartment, listening to the radio. The children were at school. John sat at his desk and did what accountants do. He made a calculation. If his family lost the house, they'd be humiliated. If his children grew up poor, they'd be corrupted by poverty's desperation. If Patricia pursued acting, she'd lose her soul. If Helen continued drinking, she'd die a sinner. But if they died now, before the foreclosure, before the poverty, before the corruption, they'd die in a state of grace. They attended church. They believed in Jesus. According to Lutheran doctrine, they'd be saved. And if John killed them, that would be murder. Murder was a sin, but it wasn't suicide. And sins could be forgiven if you truly repented. The logic was airtight. Insane, but airtight. John spent the next 11 days planning. He researched every detail with the same methodical precision he'd brought to accounting. He thought through scenarios, contingencies, the order of operations that would minimize suffering and maximize efficiency. He wasn't emotional about it. He was solving a problem. On November 8th, a Monday evening, John went to the bank and withdrew what little money remained in their accounts. He stopped the mail and milk delivery, telling the postman and milkman the family was going on vacation to visit relatives in North Carolina. He wrote letters to the children's schools, explaining they'd be absent for a few weeks due to a family trip. He called his mother's doctor and canceled her upcoming appointments. Everything had to appear normal until he was far enough away that they couldn't catch him. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, John List woke at 6 a.m. for the last time in that house. He made coffee. He ate breakfast. He loaded his 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic pistol and his .22 caliber Colt revolver. He laid out 5 sleeping bags in the ballroom, the most remote room in the mansion, where bodies wouldn't be visible from any window. Then he waited for his family to wake up. 9 a.m., Tuesday, November 9th, 1971. Temperature, 48 degrees. Helen Taylor List was 46 years old. She'd been beautiful once, with dark hair and striking features. Now she was heavy, tired, worn down by a marriage that had become a prison. She had no job, no independence, no escape. She spent her days maintaining the facade of a happy suburban housewife while drinking herself through the endless hours of emptiness. That morning, Helen came downstairs in her bathrobe, probably planning to make coffee, maybe start on the breakfast dishes. John was in the kitchen, which wasn't unusual. He was always up early. She walked past him, toward the coffee pot. John raised the 9mm pistol and shot her in the back of the head. Helen fell forward against the stove, then slid to the floor. Blood spread across the black and white linoleum tiles. The impact of the bullet had killed her instantly. She never knew it was coming, never had time to be afraid. John stood there for a moment, looking at his wife's body, the woman he'd married 20 years ago, the mother of his 3 youngest children. He felt nothing, no rage, no grief. Just the calm certainty that he was doing what needed to be done. He dragged Helen's body through the house to the ballroom, leaving a trail of blood across the hardwood floors. He laid her carefully on one of the sleeping bags, arranged her arms at her sides. The classical music he'd set up was already playing. Soft, reverent. He went back to clean the blood from the kitchen floor. The children were at school. His mother was upstairs. He had hours before the next phase. 11:30 a.m. Alma List was 84 years old, nearly deaf, with severe arthritis that made it difficult to walk. She lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor, rarely leaving, dependent on John for everything: food, medicine, companionship. She'd given him the house. She trusted him absolutely. John climbed the stairs to the third floor. His mother was in her apartment, probably listening to her radio, which she kept at maximum volume because of her deafness. John knocked, then entered. Alma turned, smiled at her son. She couldn't hear the music playing downstairs, couldn't know what had already happened to Helen 2 floors below. John raised the 9mm pistol and shot her in the face. Alma List fell backward in her chair. The bullet had entered just above her left eye. John dragged her body down 2 flights of stairs, each step a distinct thud as her weight pulled against him. He laid her in the ballroom next to Helen, arranged her just as carefully. 2 down, 3 to go.
John made himself lunch, a sandwich, methodical and precise. He sat at the kitchen table, eating slowly, while 2 bodies lay arranged in the ballroom and 3 children were at school, learning math and history, completely unaware that their lives were about to end. At 3 p.m., the front door opened. Patricia came home first. Patricia List was 16 years old, a junior at Westfield High School. She loved theater, dreamed of being an actress someday. She was vibrant, energetic, everything her father wasn't. She bounded into the house with her school books, calling out, "I'm home!" John was waiting in the hallway with the 9mm. Patricia saw him, saw the gun. Her face registered confusion before it registered fear. "Dad? What?" John fired. The bullet struck Patricia in the face. She fell backward, books scattering across the floor. John approached, fired again to ensure she was dead. Then he dragged his daughter's body to the ballroom, laid her next to her mother and grandmother. 3 sleeping bags occupied now. 2 more to go. 3:45 p.m. Frederick List was 13 years old. He played soccer, was good at math, wanted to be an engineer like the men who designed the Apollo rockets. He was the quietest of John's children, the most like his father in temperament, serious, thoughtful, obedient. John Frederick came home and met the same fate as his sister. 1 shot, then another. His body dragged to the ballroom, his face turned toward the ceiling, eyes open, seeing nothing. 5:30 p.m. The sky outside had darkened. Temperature had dropped to 44 degrees. The house at 431 Hillside Avenue sat quiet, except for the classical music playing endlessly in the ballroom. Frederick Michael List, called Frederick to distinguish him from his brother, was 15 years old. He played varsity soccer, was popular at school, had a girlfriend. He was running late because of soccer practice. When he finally came home, it was nearly 6 p.m. John was waiting by the door, but something went wrong. Frederick saw his father with the gun. He didn't freeze like Patricia. He ran. Frederick made it to the 2nd floor before John caught him. They struggled. Frederick fought for his life, fought with the desperation of a teenage boy who understood in those final seconds that his father meant to kill him. John fired multiple times, 9 bullets in total. Some missed, hitting walls. Others found their target. Frederick List fell on the 2nd floor landing. Blood pooled beneath him. John stood over his youngest son, breathing hard. This one had fought back. This one hadn't gone quietly. John dragged Frederick's body to the ballroom, laid him with the others. 5 bodies, 5 sleeping bags. The music continued playing.
John List spent the next 2 hours cleaning. He wiped down surfaces, tried to remove bloodstains from the floors. He couldn't get them all. The ballroom floor was soaked with blood from 5 bodies. But he tried. That was important to him. Maintaining appearances, even now. At 8 p.m., John walked through the house one final time. He turned off most of the lights. He left the music playing in the ballroom, a continuous loop that would play for 31 days until someone finally entered the house. He'd set the thermostat to 50 degrees, cold enough to slow decomposition. He took a small suitcase with a change of clothes and what little money he had. He locked the front door. He got into his Chevrolet Impala and drove away from 431 Hillside Avenue, heading west on Route 22 toward a new life under a new name, leaving behind 5 bodies and a house full of blood. For 31 days, the house sat undisturbed. Mail piled up despite John's attempts to stop it. Milk bottles accumulated on the porch. Neighbors noticed, but assumed the family had extended their vacation. Patricia's drama teacher called the school, asking why she'd missed rehearsals. The school called the house. No answer. It was December 7th, 1971, when the police finally entered. A neighbor had called, concerned about the accumulation of mail and newspapers, the lights that had been on for over a month, the strange smell coming from the house. Westfield police officer William Taylor forced entry at 2:15 p.m. The smell hit him immediately. He'd been a cop for 12 years, but nothing had prepared him for this. He found them in the ballroom. 5 bodies, badly decomposed after 31 days. The classical music still playing, the thermostat set to 50 degrees. Taylor backed out of the room and radioed for backup. Within an hour, the scene was swarming with police, forensics, detectives. Chief James Moran, 51 years old, veteran of 29 years with Westfield PD, stood in the ballroom looking at what remained of the List family. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. They found John List's confession letter on his desk upstairs. 5 pages, typed neatly, explaining in detail why he'd done what he'd done. The financial troubles, his belief that poverty would corrupt his children, his certainty that he was saving their souls. The letter ended with instructions for his pastor to conduct funeral services and his hope that someday everyone would understand he'd done the right thing. The manhunt began immediately. John List's photo was distributed nationwide. His car was found at JFK Airport 10 days later, but the trail went cold. He'd used cash, hadn't used his social security number, had simply vanished.
For 18 years, John List lived under the name Robert Peter Clark. He moved to Denver, then to Richmond, Virginia. He worked as an accountant. He remarried in 1985 a woman named Dolores Miller, who had no idea who he really was. He attended church every Sunday. He lived quietly, methodically, maintaining the same facade he'd maintained in Westfield. But in 1989, America's Most Wanted featured the List case. A forensic sculptor named Frank Bender created a bust showing what John List might look like 18 years later. Older, balder, with sagging features, but still unmistakably the same man. On June 1st, 1989, a woman in Richmond saw the episode and recognized her neighbor Robert Clark. She called the FBI. When FBI agents knocked on the door of Robert Clark's apartment on June 1st, 1989, John List answered. He didn't run, didn't resist. He simply said, "I knew this day would come." The trial of John List began on April 12, 1990, in Union County Courthouse in Elizabeth, New Jersey. He faced 5 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession letter, the forensics, John's own admission that he'd killed his family. The defense argued insanity. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that John had been in a dissociative state, that the pressures had broken his mind. The prosecution argued premeditation, the 11 days of planning, the methodical execution, the cleanup, the escape. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, Judge William L. Wertheimer addressed John List directly. After 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John Frederick List to rise from the grave. John List received 5 consecutive life sentences plus 5 years. He would die in prison. John List served 18 years in New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. He worked in the prison library. He attended chapel services every Sunday. He never expressed remorse. In multiple interviews, he maintained that he'd saved his family's souls, that killing them had been an act of love. He said in a 2002 interview, "I wish I hadn't done it, but I believe they're in heaven, and I'll see them again someday." On March 21, 2008, John List died of complications from pneumonia at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton. He was 82 years old. His wife Dolores, who'd stood by him despite everything, was at his bedside. His final words were reported to be, "I'm ready to face judgment." The house at 431 Hillside Avenue, Breeznell, was destroyed by fire in August 1972, 9 months after the murders. The fire was ruled arson. Locals suspected someone from the List family's church had burned it, unwilling to let the cursed house stand. The lot remained empty for years. Eventually, a new house was built there, though the address was changed to avoid the stigma. Patricia List would have been 69 years old today. John Frederick would have been 68. Frederick would have been 66. They never got to grow up, never got to chase their dreams, never got to have families of their own. They died because their father valued appearances more than their lives. Helen List, who'd endured an unhappy marriage for 20 years, died never knowing she could have just left. Divorce wasn't easy in 1971, but it was possible. She could have taken her children and started over. But she stayed, trapped by the same expectations that trapped John. The belief that appearances mattered more than truth. Dolores Clark List, who married Robert Clark in 1985, lived with the knowledge that she'd shared a bed with a man who'd murdered his entire family. She never divorced him. When asked why, she said, "I married him for better or worse." She died in 2010, 2 years after John, taking her reasons to the grave.
John List's case haunts us because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about pride, control, and the American dream's dark side. Here was a man who wasn't a psychopath. He had no prior violence. He wasn't on drugs. He wasn't mentally ill in any clinical sense. He was just a man who couldn't accept failure, who valued pride over life, who believed his way was the only way. The question that remains, that haunts everyone who studies this case, was John List a man driven to desperate acts by impossible circumstances, or was he simply a narcissist who murdered his family rather than admit he'd failed? Both can be true. That's the uncomfortable answer. John List was crushed by expectations he couldn't meet. The pressure to provide, the shame of failure, the rigid Lutheran doctrine that offered salvation for any sin except suicide. These pressures were real, but millions of men face financial ruin, face unemployment, face the collapse of their carefully constructed lives. They don't murder their families. What separated John List was his absolute inability to accept humiliation, his belief that appearances mattered more than lives, his certainty that his way of seeing the world was correct and everyone else was wrong. He destroyed what he claimed to love rather than let anyone see him fail. That's not love. That's ownership. That's the belief that his family existed to validate him. And when they couldn't anymore, when they became evidence of his failure, they had no right to exist. The tragic irony is that by killing his family to save them from poverty and humiliation, John List ensured they'd be remembered only for how they died. Patricia's dreams of acting, Frederick's soccer games, John Frederick's love of math, all erased. They became the List family murders, instead of people with lives and futures. And John himself, who killed to avoid humiliation, became one of America's most notorious family annihilators. The name John List is synonymous with familicide. The very thing he feared most, being seen as a failure, became his eternal legacy. If this story made you think about pride, control, and the deadly cost of caring more about appearances than truth, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about ordinary people capable of extraordinary darkness. Comment below. Where is the line between providing for your family and destroying them to protect your ego? Because John List's story isn't unique. Every year, men facing financial ruin make similar calculations. Most don't kill, but some do. And the question we never answer satisfactorily is, what transforms pride into murder? John List sat in his study on October 28, 1971, and made a choice. He chose his pride over his family's lives. He chose control over freedom. He chose death over the possibility of resilience, of rebuilding, of discovering that his worth wasn't measured by his bank account or his neighbor's opinions. And 5 people died because one man couldn't accept that failure is human, that humiliation is survivable, that losing everything material doesn't mean you've lost everything. The line between protective father and family annihilator isn't drawn in circumstances. It's drawn in the human heart, where pride and love wage eternal war. And for John List, pride won. The music played for 31 days in that ballroom. Classical, reverent, holy. Playing over 5 bodies arranged on sleeping bags like some twisted religious ritual. Playing while John List drove west toward a new life, convinced he'd saved his family's souls by ending their lives. But souls can't be saved by bullets, and love doesn't murder what it cherishes. John List didn't save anyone. He just killed 5 people and spent 18 years pretending he was someone else. Until the day the FBI knocked on his door and he had to finally face what he'd done. And even then, even after 18 years of running, he couldn't admit the truth, that he'd murdered his family not to save them, but to save himself from shame. In the end, the only thing John List proved is that some men would rather kill than be seen as failures. And that's not theology. That's not love. That's just pride dressed up in scripture and called righteousness. The house is gone. The bodies are buried. John List is dead. But the question remains, hanging in the air like that music in the ballroom. How many families will be destroyed by men who can't accept that their worth isn't measured by their ability to maintain appearances? And when will we learn that the most dangerous man isn't the stranger in the shadows? It's the father who believes his family's lives matter less than his pride.
Subscribe for more stories that challenge what you think you know about justice, humanity, and the darkness we're all capable of.